की मोहब्बत मेरा हक है और ये हक मैं लेके रहूंगा.
Now, I remember the hype that surrounded this trailer when it came out, and deservedly so. I mean, what didn't this movie have? A star-studded cast, breathtaking cinematography, beautiful music and costumes, confusing plotline, but unfortunately, the hype surrounding Kalank died just as soon as the movie hit the theatres. Why? Let's explore in this video. In case you didn't already know, my name is Daljit. I love Bollywood movies and I love storytelling. So let's delve into this video, what went wrong with the movie Kalank. Now, I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you have already seen the movie, but in case you haven't, let's do a quick recap before we delve into the details. Okay, so the movie starts with our girl Satya, played by Sonakshi Sinha, and we discover that she only has 1 year left to live because she's dying. What from? We're not exactly told. Before she dies, Satya wants to see her husband resettled, so she asks Roop, our main character, to live with her and her husband for a year in the hopes that Roop will eventually marry her husband. Now, Roop is the eldest daughter of 3 and they live with their very poor father. So they need security. That's why Roop says, I will only come and live with you if I can marry your husband beforehand. I ain't going without a title. So then Roop and Satya's husband Dev get married and she moves to Husnabad. We meet Zafar, who we learn has a personal vendetta against Dev's father, Balraj, because coincidentally he is also Zafar's father. Now, Zafar is never accepted as a son by Balraj because he is the product of an affair with a courtesan named Bahar Begum. And when Zafar and Roop meet, he comes up with a plan to make her fall in love with her and ultimately ruin his father. Oh, and all of this is taking place in 1945 India, so right before the partition, and there is a lot of political turmoil and unrest going on in the background between Muslims and Hindus. Now, Roop has started to go to Bahar Begum to learn how to sing, and at the same time, she also works for the newspaper that her husband Dev owns, which is at the center of all of these political tensions. The newspaper is promoting industrialization, which the Muslim workers complain about. With every article that comes out of this newspaper, unrest is growing, protests are increasing. Now, all goes jolly well for a little while. Roop has started to fall in love with Zafar. Zafar has started to have some conflicting feelings. Ultimately, he starts feeling guilty. Then Roop learns Zafar's identity, that he really is her husband's half-brother. Now, at this point, the country is literally at the cusp of partition. Dev's newspaper has published an article that is absolutely outrageous and riots break out in the street. Zafar, Roop and Dev, they end up having to flee a mob and trying to protect Roop and Dev. Zafar ends up getting killed and that is pretty much the end of it. I think I captured most of it. That was pretty much the story. Now, I did have a think about what would be the most constructive way of splitting up this video and going through the story. As I was making my notes when I rewatched this movie, I realized that there was very little things that genuinely worked in this movie. So I have split up the topics into main sections of what didn't work. Now, first of all, the storyline was weak. The trope of forbidden love in the format of a historical epic is something that we've seen in the past many times. I mean, it's a derivative of many stories from the likes of Mughal-e-Azam, Devdas, Baji Rao Mastani, Fitur, Mausam, Lutera. You get the point. Some of the more interesting aspects of the story, however, like the complexity of Roop's marriage to a man who is still desperately in love with his terminally ill wife, the lack of their son's acceptance from both of Zafar's parents, the relationship between a courtesan and a married man, all were explored at a very surface level and didn't really get the time that they needed as part of this movie. The socio-political aspect of Hindu-Muslim divides, communal riots, industrialization putting workers out of jobs, all felt more like a plot device than a well-integrated part of the narrative. There are some really strong topics that could have served as central themes to this story. We're talking about love versus duty, class versus love, religion, politics, and all of this gets almost brushed under the carpet in light of the importance of the love story that goes on between the main characters, which was questionable to say the least. Now, moving on to the next part, which is probably where this story has the most lost potential, is the underdeveloped characters. Starting off with Roop, our main character, who entirely lacks any type of agency. We know that Roop decides to marry Dev, an already married man, and sacrifices her dreams, her freedom, for the sake of her family. Yet her family is never mentioned again. We never see them again. nor does she have any sense of duty as a wife or towards her in-laws. And yes, you could argue that she's a very strong-willed character. At the beginning of the movie, she even mentions that now that she's married, she's performed her duty, and that was towards her own family. But what that leads to is an under-exploration of emotional depth that she could have had as a character and what could have driven her motivation. I mean, the love versus duty dilemma is something that we have seen before, but it's also something that really resonates with the audience, and they could have played into this so much more in the movie.
I love him, Mom. I really...
It could have been a central theme, and also the main cause for Roop's internal conflict, which we don't see in this movie whatsoever. Even that end scene where you see Roop and Zafar struggling because they know they're not meant for each other, they're not meant to be together, their love has been doomed from the start. That didn't hit nearly as strongly as it could have, because we don't see this internal conflict in Roop's character from the very beginning. She's been rebellious and she hasn't listened to literally anything that her in-laws have said. Roop's desires are also kind of conflicting in the story. We know that she wants to learn how to sing from Bahar Begum, which acts as a catalyst for her to go to Hiramandi, and she meets Bahar Begum and she meets Zafar for the first time, and that's how she sort of gets entangled in their lives. But at the same time, she also goes to work for the newspaper that is owned by her husband, and she wants to write a news article on the people of Hiramandi, which is the reason why Zafar hangs around with her so much. They spend so much time together and eventually they fall in love. So this entire plotline of her wanting to sing and wanting to train with Bahar Begum kind of serves no purpose whatsoever other than a few beautiful scenes and a really nice song. I mean, they could have just had her wanting to write an article, and she could have hung out with all of these characters, spend a lot more time with them together, and really gotten to know some of these people in a lot more depth. Imagine if she wanted to write an article on the courtesans of Hiramandi. She could have interviewed Bahar Begum, she could have gotten to know more about her tragic past, and they would have utilized that screen time in so much more of an effective way. Okay, moving on to Dev. He is mostly a passive character. Now, I actually like Dev as a character. He has got some really admirable traits, but mostly throughout the entire story, he remains pretty passive, rather than an active participant who drives forward his own motives that ultimately impact other characters. Okay, so this is potentially going to be a controversial one, but people might agree with me, but I think this change could have potentially changed the story for the better. And that is that Satya should never have been a part of the story. The only purpose for her character in the story is to get Roop married to her husband Dev, and to showcase that Dev still is madly in love with his wife. So there is no potential for a relationship between Dev and Roop. We get that, but we don't need Satya in the story for that. She has no motivation of her own. She has no background. She has no past that we know of. And if you were to take her out of the story, it literally would have made no difference whatsoever. We needed to get Roop married to Dev, which we could have achieved just as easily by having Balraj go to Roop's family instead of Satya. The story could have had Roop's family make a promise to Satya in the past, and the story starts where Satya has now died and Roop has to go and fulfill this promise. They could have still created that same tension between Roop and Dev, where Dev is still in love with his now dead wife, he's in denial, and he doesn't want anything to do with Roop. That could have achieved the exact same thing. And do you know what this film would have done? It would have saved so much screen time. Moving on to Bahar Begum, though pivotal to the story, felt like missed potential. As Zafar's estranged mother, as a courtesan who had an affair with a married man, and who is still in love with this wealthy, well-reputed man who cares more about his reputation and the name and title of his family than he did about the woman that he once potentially was in love with. We don't know. We don't really get to see or explore much of that. My point being is that her character has got so much potential for added complexity, and we don't get to see any of that. Her presence is mostly used for reciting poetic lines and for exposition about Zafar's past. There is a lot of telling through dialogue that she loves Balraj so much and that she regrets how she treated her son, but we don't get to see any of that. We see her talking about it. The song, Tabaa Ho Gaye, where she laments how she destroyed herself in loving someone else, therefore is also less impactful. Regardless, I would like to say though, the scene where Zafar enters at the end of that song and is so angry with her mother for ruining his only chance at true love and then ends up crying in her arms was still really, really emotional. But I think it would have just hit so much harder if all of these characters would have been fleshed out just a little more. Also, I just wanted to add her last scene where she makes the ultimate sacrifice as a woman, as a good mother, and lets her son leave, but she stays behind to protect the girls of her establishment. It just didn't have that emotional impact that it should have had with a fully fleshed out character who has their own desires, wants, motivations, their own flaws that were impacted by their past, and you get to see that, and you get to see how their decisions even today are impacted by their past, by those flaws.
Wow, man. Gina ko itong sasik.
All of that just doesn't get explored at all for any of these characters. Lastly, we have Balraj, and I would just like to add, he had a much more significant stake than Satya, and yet Satya was given significantly more screen time. Probably the most important is that Balraj Chaudhary's past, his mistakes, his decisions, are what have impacted most of these characters. His sons, Dev Chaudhary and Zafar, even Satya to some extent, and also, very importantly, Bahar Begum. All of their lives have been impacted because of this man's mistakes. Considering that he cares so much about his image and his reputation, he's actually a very passive character. We see Roop at the beginning of the movie making a fuss about wanting to go sing with Bahar Begum and visit this woman that he has previously had an affair with and has a son with that he refuses to accept, all of which would tarnish the name of his family. And yet we see it resolved pretty much in the next scene where Satya tells him that Roop's a very obstinate girl. If we don't let her go, she's just gonna go. And he does nothing about it. It's just so out of character and it just doesn't make any sense. We also see later on in the movie that Balraj, Sanjay Dutt, goes to Roop and tells her that they are moving out of Husnabad, and she just outright refuses. And he walks away. Probably the most frustrating thing about his character is that there is no arc whatsoever. And you can have characters with flat arcs, but you see that he cares for his son Dev. He cares about his opinion, and he also does love his son, which you eventually see towards the end of the movie. But there is no acceptance of Zafar. There is no acceptance of his mistakes or how he has treated Bahar Begum, how he has treated his wife who is now dead. We learn through his son Dev that she was mistreated and that she was even willing to accept his illegitimate son Zafar to have a complete family. Plus, we don't really get any closure for Zafar at the end of the movie, who has given up on his vengeance. He has sacrificed his love, and yet he doesn't even get called son by his father, which is probably what he wanted from the very start. Okay, so moving on to character dynamics. Firstly, Roop and Zafar's love story, which is at the center of this movie, feels a little unearned. There is this scene at the beginning of the movie where there is a bullfight. Zafar goes and fights a bull, which Roop witnesses as part of this spectacle where loads of people come to watch this fight. He survives, naturally. You see Roop pushing him away, though it is the second or third time that she's met him, and she's also very wary of his flamboyant manners. Yet this scene felt like there was a level of intimacy that just wasn't earned. Also, so Roop wants to write this article on the people of Hiramandi. So Zafar takes it upon him and gets her to meet all of these people, shows her around the place. But other than that, we don't really see them connect on a deeper level. The only connection that we do see is from Zafar's side, because Roop calls him out on certain things. Like, why does he always look for the negative in things? But other than that, there is literally no connection between the two of them. I already touched upon this in the storyline being weak section, so I won't go to too much detail here, but Roop and Dev's marriage just felt inadequately explored. Zafar and Bahar Begum's mother-son relationship could have pulled at some really emotional strings, which we didn't unfortunately get to see. There was also a scene between Roop and Bahar Begum where they were having a heart-to-heart, and she admitted that she had feelings for Zafar. Yet this heart-to-heart just felt like it came out of nowhere. We see the two of them have a couple of scenes together where Roop learns how to sing from Bahar Begum, but there is no indication of them having any type of closeness whatsoever. And as mentioned earlier, the relationship between Balraj and Zafar unfortunately goes unexplored. In fact, we only get to see one scene in the entire movie of them two being together and having a conversation face to face. Okay, so next section, which I think is a major one, would be to cut all of the unnecessary scenes. Roop's intro, which is at the start of the movie, happens through the form of a song. And I think the idea was to show how free-spirited she is, but we don't really get to see her dynamics with her family that she really cares about, who she sacrificed her freedom, which is so important to her, for. As a song, it just doesn't seem as impactful, as lovely as the song was. There's also this scene where we, I think, are supposed to understand what her dreams and aspirations are when she finally accepts that she's going to have to marry an already married man, and she starts burning things, and we see books burning. But it literally doesn't mean anything to us because we don't know what her dreams and aspirations are. There is a scene later on in the movie where she explains to Dev that she really loves reading, but I mean, she's literally telling us. We don't really get to see her read a book or discuss the impacts of it with another character. This is, I think, another problem that this movie really has, which is that it does a lot of telling and not showing. There is a lot of dialogue, there is a lot of exposition, but there isn't enough showing. Talking about unnecessary scenes, one thing that really frustrated me as I was watching this movie is that we kept doing this flash forward 10 years ahead of present time, where Alia Bhatt Roop was being interviewed by this random guy. She's talking to him about her love story. We don't get to understand why she's being interviewed, and we don't really understand why she's talking about her personal life. Eventually, towards the end of the movie, that article gets released and it talks about the partition, the impact that it left on people being separated. That is such an important and heavy topic, and it's such a pivotal part of India and Pakistan's history, and it's just added in there like an afterthought. What was the point of doing that? Firstly, it was taking away from the main story. The central theme was not what happened to the people after the partition, so why even include it in there? Finally, what the hell was that ball scene? The CGI looked terrible. It didn't add anything to the story whatsoever. It was a waste of money, it was a waste of screen time, it was a waste of story. And then finally, what didn't really work was the overindulgence in visuals. Director Abhishek Varman clearly had a vision for this movie, and I remember reading somewhere that Kalank was supposed to be the first movie that he directed, not Two States. Imagine the impact that would have had on his career. Genuinely, this movie was a treat for the eyes. Every single scene visually was stunning. It was up there alongside Sanjay Leela Bhansali movies, some of the most beautiful cinematography that I've ever seen. But while the cinematography and set design were astonishing, the focus on the aesthetics and creating beautiful scenes were often prioritized over getting the story right. And that is where I think this movie really missed the mark. Okay, so I do realize that the list of things that didn't work for this movie that I included in this video is very long, but that doesn't mean that this movie is all bad. There were actually some good scenes in this movie that I would just like to mention. Some of those included the interactions between Roop and Dev. One scene that I thought was really impactful was when Roop comes home late one night and she runs into Dev, who literally just looks at his watch and he walks away. He kind of acknowledges that she's acting out of bounds as the daughter-in-law of this household. That scene just said a lot without saying anything. The scene where the ad of Lux Soap gets added in the newspaper was quite sweet. It was a good example of showing, not telling, even though I would find it a little hard to believe that women would just want to buy a newspaper because they're seeing an advertisement of soap. And then Dev observing Roop at a party, that was quite a good scene as well. And then finally, probably my two most favourite scenes in the movie. The first one where we see Dev and Balraj, and at the same time Zafar and Bahar Begum interact with each other. And you see the opposition and the contrast, but at the same time the similarity between both brothers and their dynamics that they have with their respective father and mother. And you see the struggles that Dev has had with accepting the mistakes of his father. And at the same time, Zafar is struggling to accept his mother for the impact that her mistakes have had on his life. That is probably the closest that we get to exploring some of the emotional depth of all four of these characters. And then the second one is when Zafar and Dev meet for the first time, and neither of them know that the other is their brother. So they talk about their problems, how conflicted they are because of their situation. One is in love with a married woman, the other is struggling to fall in love with his second wife whilst his first wife had just died. And then we actually see them bond over the celebration of Eid. Okay, so final verdict of this movie. Whilst having stunning visuals, breathtaking cinematography, some actually really good performances performances and such a stellar cast. Overall, I think the story in itself lacked depth. It lacked depth in terms of the external plot, the socio-political turmoil that could have been explored, the impact that it could have had on all of these characters. It lacks emotional depth of all of the characters. This movie had some really complex topics to explore and it didn't really do that, and as a result of that, it just lacks depth. And for that, this movie should get 2 buckets out of 5. That is my scoring system. Okay, so that's it. If you like this video, then please like this video. I would love to hear from you, and I would love to hear what your thoughts are on the movie Kalan. Yeah, until next time.